Detroit. I mean, you can't get more, hardcore economists from the city of Detroit. So please welcome Matt Fisher.
Thank you, Dan. That was a very kind introduction. And thank you for offering this. It's an honor to be asked to speak. I really appreciate the opportunity to come and say a few things about globalization. As you can see, the title of my talk is Emerging Markets, Trade, and Poverty in a Globalizing World. That's pretty vague, and actually I came up with that title before I ever really knew what I was going to say. I think this talk will be maybe very different from what some of you, let me put it this way, it may very well challenge some beliefs that people have about globalization, about emerging markets, poverty, and trade. The only thing I ask now, I see many of my students in this class, I've already indoctrinated all you guys, so I don't have to worry about that. But many of you, I don't know. And all I ask is that you have an open mind through the talk. I look forward to a Q&A session, a lively Q&A session. So we'll see when we get there. Can we maybe flip off light? I think that would help a little bit to so we can see. Yeah, that's good. This is going to work, is it? No. That's fine. Louis XIV was the King of France from 1643 until his death in 1717. He's the longest serving monarch in the history of Europe, and by many accounts, he was the most powerful person in the world during the latter half of the 17th and the early 18th centuries. The most notorious hallmark of Louis's reign, and one that high school students everywhere read about, was Louis's consolidation of French political power in his own absolute monarchy. Famously, Louis was a major patron of the arts. He commissioned many works of art that are still widely studied today. Poets such as Molière and Racine, painters such as Rigaud and Le Brun, as well as the great Italian sculptor Bernini, all worked for Louis, and each of them created some of the most famous works of art of the 17th century under his patronage. After 1682, Louis's rule was from the Palace of Versailles, which was a 721,000 square foot residence commissioned by the king to house his family, his voluminous court entourage, as well as certain members of the French aristocracy on whom Louis wanted to keep an eye. He wed his first wife, Maria Theresa of Spain, in 1660. Maria Theresa bore 6 children during their marriage. The first, Louis the Dauphin, lived until the age of 49. The second, Anne Elizabeth, lived just 42 days. The third, Marie Anne, lived 40 days. The fourth, Marie Therese, died at the age of 5. The fifth, Philippe Charles, lived only 2 years and 11 months. And the sixth, Louis Francois, died after only 4 months. That is, 5 of the 6 Bourbon children died before reaching adolescence. However, all 6 of them, as well as Maria Theresa, would ultimately precede Louis in death. When Louis did die in 1717, it was of gangrene. Louis XIV was inordinately wealthy, powerful, and famous during his lifetime. He built one of the most extravagant homes in the history of the world up to that point. He had the whole of France at his command. And he had more sexual partners than is or was appropriate. Yet for all of his power, status, prestige, for all of these earthly goods that Louis apparently had in such abundance, he was powerless against typhoid, typhus, cholera, diphtheria, tuberculosis, and dozens of other diseases and maladies that are easily treated and prevented in the developed world today. I do not suspect that anyone in this room lives in a house even 1/100th the size of Louis'. And probably a few of us live in a home that is less than 1/1000th of the total square footage. Yet I ask you, would you trade the vaccinations and cures that we have, cures which we often take for granted today, for all of the wealth, prestige, and power of Louis XIV? For his 700,000 square foot home adorned with priceless pieces of art and eager to impress and appease hangers-on? To my mind, there are a few things worse that one can suffer than the painful death of one's helpless child. One of the things that I can think of that is worse is the death of the next four. Yet today, we almost never hear of such tragedies occurring in the West. Back in the 17th century, the most powerful man in the world was helpless when faced with bacterial infections and diseases that you and I only ever think about when we take our children in for their immunizations. Why is today so different? Why do even the poorest members of our country today have access to vaccinations when 350 years ago, even the most powerful men who ruled kingdoms suffered without, and as a result watched their children die slowly and agonizingly, one after the other? Now at this point, I must be explicit about the fact that what I've just told you regarding the French royal family is a mere anecdote. It is what people in the press might call a human interest story. And from this anecdote, I'm implying something much larger about the development of medicine, health, and wealth over the last 350 years. More than that, I'm implying that each and every one of us in this room has access to a basket of goods that we prefer more than the basket of goods Louis XIV had access to. The anecdote implies that in several extremely important ways, all of us are wealthier than even kings were not too long ago. That's not really fair of me to do. After all, the world is multifarious, and should we look long and hard enough, we can find anecdotes that appear to support any narrative we feel like telling. Simply because I can corral some anecdotes about the lack of vaccinations and other healthcare services hundreds of years ago, that doesn't mean that I've communicated a narrative that accurately reflects, on average, the reality of the lived experiences of the people who have been alive over these past 350 years. The political scientist Raymond Wolfinger is fond of saying that, quote, the plural of anecdote is data. So what do the data have with respect to the larger narrative I have just implied? Well, if you were born in England in 1650, you had a life expectancy of about 35 years. If you, unlike five of six of the children of the King of France, managed to make it to adolescence, then you would work an average of 40 hours a week, likely on a subsistence farm. Sadly, neither teaching at nor attending a community college was a feasible option for the 17th century English peasant. Since 1800, which is still 83 years after Louis's death, the population of the world has multiplied 6 times, and average life expectancy has more than doubled. And we don't even have to go that far back in time to find incredible improvements in the material conditions faced by previously extremely poor people. Between 1981 and 2010, 680 million Chinese people exited extreme poverty. In these 30 years, the Chinese reduced their extreme poverty rate from 84% to 10%. Over that same time period, nearly 1 billion people worldwide escaped extreme poverty. Moreover, the poor in the developing world grew their consumption twice as fast as the world as a whole from 1980 to 2000. As late as 1950, at least 1 billion people out of a total population of about 2.5 billion were thought to be going hungry every day. Today, that number is below 1 billion out of about 7 billion people. In other words, in 6 decades, in just 60 years, the percentage of the human population that suffered from hunger and malnutrition went from nearly 40% to less than 15%, while the absolute number of people who were provided an adequate diet rose fourfold, from 1.5 billion to 6 billion. This is even more remarkable given that if 1950s technology had been used in these later decades, an additional land area equivalent to South America would have been needed to be plowed under in the process. By 2003, the world's income per person had risen to $6,516, 10 times the level of 1820. In the West, income per person soared to $23,710, nearly 20 times the figure of 1820. By the middle of the 20th century, death resulting from the diseases I mentioned earlier had been all but eradicated in the developed world, and today their outright rates of incidence in the developing world are falling dramatically. Obviously, there is much, much more to do, but the trends that we see are almost all accelerating in the right direction. We're used to hearing doom and gloom, but discussion cannot blink the fact that all of us in this room are incredibly wealthy and healthy on a historical scale. We still have poverty in this country, but it is a relative poverty. Today's poor in America enjoy a basket of goods that a 17th century peasant could not even imagine. To deny this is to be ignorant of the lives and material conditions of our ancestors. But why, again, why is our world so different from the one known by our ancestors? My job is to teach economics here at Ivy Tech. Some of you may have heard that my talk today is going to be a defense of sweatshops. Now, if you know this much, you might be expecting me to talk about how, despite their horrid working conditions and low wages, sweatshops are economically efficient. And I may even be able to convince you of the economics of it. But of course, you might then say to me, well, fine, Matt, the economics of it work out, but what about the ethics? Aren't sweatshops offensive on an ethical level? Really, how relevant are the economics when at bottom it's actually a question of ethics? And many people seem to believe that this is the kind of gotcha question to which people who study and write about the economics of sweatshops are incapable of replying. Yet, despite what you might have heard, or what you might believe, this talk I'm giving today is not about economic efficiency. Neither is it about profits, or justifying the practice of putting profits over people, whatever that might mean. This talk is not even a defense of sweatshops per se, although some might misconstrue it as such. As a matter of fact, to be perfectly honest with you, I would very much like to see sweatshops completely eradicated. So, sorry to burst your bubble, but no, this will not be a defense of sweatshops. Rather, I intend for my talk to be a defense of workers. In particular, it's a defense of those workers in low-wage countries who work in what we call sweatshops. My concern is for these individuals. So let me be absolutely clear on this point. My concern is not for the shareholders of Nike or Walmart. My concern is not for Kathy Lee Gifford. And it is not for relatively highly paid factory workers in America, all of whom have relatively easy access to a more highly valued basket of goods than the most powerful man in the world did 350 years ago. And my concern is certainly not for Western consumers, all of whom enjoy a historically absurd amount of wealth and advantage. Again, my concern is for those workers. For the low-wage workers employed in sweatshops. My argument will be essentially moral in nature. Now, it is true that I will use economic analysis to reach my conclusions. But economics itself is but a positive science. That is, economics tells us nothing of what ought to be. By itself, it tells us nothing of the telos. None of the social sciences ever do. The best economics can do is teach us about the trade-offs we face in any given situation. That is to say, if applied properly, economic analysis can help us better understand and account for the costs of a given decision. But beyond this, it's up to us as moral agents to assign values and to determine the goals or desired ends of our actions. Our ethical framework tells us what goods are to be achieved and what bads are to be avoided. Economics proper is silent on this fundamental question. Economics merely helps us to better understand the consequences of our actions, be they good, bad, or indifferent. Sometimes these consequences are not immediately evident to us. Good economics can help reveal them and so better inform our decisions. My hope is that I use good economic analysis here today to discuss the particularly difficult and sensitive question of sweatshop labor. Allow me to begin by discussing what is commonly called economic growth. Economic growth or economic development, it's deceptively simple. Actually, more accurately stated, economic growth is a paradox. It is something of a very, very difficult riddle with an answer that just about everyone knows. The answer is so simple that even the greenest of students can understand it. The arguments and discoveries of Smith and Ricardo with respect to specialization and exchange can be taught in one class meeting to any introductory student. Von Bauwerk's simple account of saving and capital accumulation, as well as its effects on labor productivity, can be taught the next time the class meets. And Solo's insights into technological innovation, they're not particularly difficult to grasp either. All three form the superstructure of any competent account of economic growth. And economists as diverse as Milton Friedman and Karl Marx are largely in agreement on the matter. So what's the trouble? The trouble rests with the fact that one cannot just snap one's fingers and make all three of these things appear. In order to foster specialization and exchange, capital accumulation, as well as technological innovation, there must needs be an institutional framework capable of nurturing and sustaining them, or at the very least capable of throttling down the desire to destroy them when and where they arise. This is the very difficult riddle. In the final analysis, economists as economists simply don't know how to develop and sustain such institutional frameworks. The reason why is that these frameworks are the flower of culture. And culture is a bottom-up, organic entity, generally impervious in every real way to the designs of the would-be social engineer. The very specific flowerings of culture, which nurture the necessary components of economic development, that is, the institutions economists point toward as conducive to lifting people out of poverty, include the rule of law, private property, sanctity of contracts, stable currency, and access to markets. But there is no 5-year plan or 12-step process for developing and sustaining these institutions in society. There's no easy way into it. Sadly, it appears as though these institutions are either there or they're not. It's true that they have been adopted in places that did not possess them previously, but no one really knows the secret to replicating these adoptions elsewhere. What we do know is that where they do exist, prosperity emerges, and where they are lacking, people remain mired in or fall into poverty. In my space here, I think that I can address at least one reason why one of these institutions is frowned upon in certain quarters. I've just now mentioned access to markets. Neoclassical and other mainstream economists are always talking about markets this, markets that, right? But what gives? Aren't global markets the path whereby multinational enterprises exploit the land, labor, and capital of less developed peoples? Isn't the growth a mere illusion created by the pillage? Isn't what we gain here as consumers at the necessary expense of the resource owners and particularly the laborers of emerging markets? In such a scenario, economists are often portrayed as conveniently blind to this reality. Those who take it a step further insinuate that economists aren't really blind at all. They're just in the pockets of ExxonMobil, Starbucks, Target, whoever else is willing to pay.